No government lasts forever. In some countries, a new regime topples the old one on a regular basis. In more stable countries, decades of stability and continuity can be achieved, but in the end, every power structure erected by mankind eventually either self-destructs or is destroyed from the outside. Why is this? Why can't we ever figure out how to share and manage power and authority without it leading to oppression and abuse that inevitably leads to resistance and rebellion? For much of human history, the fault has been placed on the system itself. People thought that if only we could devise the right form of government, our problem would be solved. At least that's what the philosophers hoped. So they tried monarchy, and it wasn't really the answer. Then they tried despotism and democracy and republics and communism and fascism. Even some people said, let's just try anarchy. The problem is more fundamental, however, than the form of government, because every government is made up of people. And when you work with imperfect tools, you will end up with an imperfect system. Consider power, the sharing of power, and the wielding of it as we turn now to 2 Chronicles. We're going to spend some time in 2 Chronicles between now and Christmas looking at the kings of Judah after Solomon. So we're beginning in 2 Chronicles chapter 10, verse 1. 2 Chronicles chapter 10, verse 1. It says this, Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all the Israelites had gone there to make him king. Whenever you read about the kings of Israel in the Bible, there are two mostly identical sources for you to consult. The book of Kings, divided into two parts in our Bible, which was written before the Babylonian exile, about 400 years after David lived, by the prophet Jeremiah, according to Jewish tradition. The other source is the book of Chronicles, also divided into two parts in our Bible, written after the Babylonian exile, about 500 years after David, by the prophet Ezra, according to Jewish tradition. So these two books are at times, word for word, exactly the same thing. But they also have their own unique focus and insight. Much the same, some people will blend them together then and just read them side by side like those who harmonize the Gospels. But when you harmonize the Gospels, the unique portrait of Jesus created by each of the authors is lost. Likewise, to set Kings and Chronicles side by side is not to take either one of them at face value. So as we look at the lives of some of the 20 kings of Judah, from Solomon to the Babylonian exile, we will do so by focusing on the account written after that exile in the book of Chronicles. Now that I got that out of the way, who is Rehoboam, and why is he about to be anointed as the king of Israel? Rehoboam was the son of Solomon, the grandson of David, and thus the third in his family line to ascend to the throne of Israel. The transition from David to Solomon had been fraught with violence. David's firstborn Absalom had rebelled against him, starting a civil war that only ended with the death of Absalom and David's great grief over that loss. Solomon was the second son of David and his wife Bathsheba, the first son having died as an infant, as a judgment from God for David's adultery with Bathsheba, and conspiracy to have her first husband Uriah killed in battle. From that low point, David had repented and returned to obedience to God, but his desire to build a temple ultimately went unfulfilled. His son Solomon greatly expanded his father's kingdom, both in territory and in influence and wealth, to the point that he was vastly wealthy. He built a renowned temple in Jerusalem. So it is this heritage that Rehoboam is about to inherit. Mostly a positive story. Both his father and grandfather had been blessed by God, although both had a period in their life of tragic mistakes. And now Rehoboam will be the third king from David's family, from the tribe of Judah, the fourth overall of Israel's kings. Now, we are not told anything in our text as to what sort of preparation or in education or wisdom that Solomon had imparted to his son Rehoboam. Nor are we told any hint as to what kind of father he had been to his son, good or bad, nor anything about what sort of son, either dutiful or spoiled, that Rehoboam had been. So it's really a blank slate for us when we look at Rehoboam. As his first public act then of significance, his coronation at Shechem will have great significance. If it goes well and he starts off on the right foot, his throne should be secure. If it goes poorly, however, who knows what may happen. Verses 2 through 4. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard this, he was in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon, he returned from Egypt. So they sent for Jeroboam, and he and all Israel went to Rehoboam and said to him, "Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." It says that Jeroboam, son of Nebat, returned from Egypt. The reason for his exile is only recorded in 1 Kings, so I will simply note that for you. From that text, we're told that the prophet Ahijah had told Jeroboam that he would be given 10 of the tribes of Israel to rule after Solomon's death, because of Solomon's sin of idolatry prompted by his many foreign wives. Solomon evidently learned of this prophecy and tried to have Jeroboam killed, which convinced him to flee to Egypt. So when Jeroboam returns upon hearing of Solomon's death, there is already significant tension in the air, with one side looking at Jeroboam as a rebel and a traitor, and the other side as a champion against the governmental abuses that we've learned about. So they sent for Jeroboam, and he and all Israel went. The potential for division clearly exists. The people choose the rebel Jeroboam as their spokesman with the newly anointed king. Whether that choice is wise because it shows Rehoboam how serious this situation is, or foolish because it will distract him and cause him to focus on the messenger instead of the message, is difficult for us to judge, even knowing what happened next. But it has certainly raised the stakes to make Rehoboam's first decision as king a make-or-break moment. So what do they want Jeroboam to say to the king? "Your father was hard on us, gave us a lot of labor, gave us a lot of taxes. Please lighten it." We have no particular reason to doubt the sincerity of this request by the people. They felt that Solomon's tax burden and forced labor for his building projects had been overly heavy. It is entirely common for people to feel that their taxes are high, regardless of how high they actually are. We all know that. Everybody's taxes are too high. Everybody always thinks that. So let us assume, though, that Solomon's taxes were too high, and that the people have a legitimate right to be upset about it. Under that assumption, they've given Rehoboam an opportunity to correct that perception by lowering the taxes. And they have promised to continue to support the Davidic dynasty if their request is granted. There is also an implied threat in that request that Rehoboam would have noticed. If the taxes are not lowered, it is implied that the people will not serve the king, and some sort of rebellion will be the result. That implication is certainly given weight by the presence of Jeroboam as their spokesman. So how will Rehoboam react to this? Should he show strength at the start of his reign in order to deter would-be rebels, or mercy to win favor for himself the love of the people? Will he take this proposal at face value, or distrust it because of the man who brings it? Rehoboam has two clear choices, either of which might have been wrong. Our critique of his upcoming decision is not going to be focused on which choice he makes, as much as it is on why he makes that choice, and how he treats his subjects in the process. The reason for this is simple, for that focus. You or I are highly unlikely to ever be the President of the United States. It's not impossible, but I don't consider it overly likely that any one of us will have a role like that at some point in our lives. We are not going to be setting any tax policy. So our discussion here is not about politics, it's not about tax policy, or even about the right of people to address the government with their grievances. For us, the focus is on how a person with power over someone else chooses to treat that person. Because in a much smaller way, we will find ourselves on both sides of that dynamic again and again in our lives. There will be times when we have power over other people, and there will be times that we are in someone else's power. Let us look at that as we look at the rest of this text. Verses 5 through 11. Rehoboam answered, "Come back to me in 3 days." So the people went away. Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon during his lifetime. "How would you advise me to answer these people?" he asked. They replied, "If you will be kind to these people and please them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants." But Rehoboam rejected the advice of the elders the advice of the elders gave him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him. He asked them, "What is your advice? How should we answer these people who say to me, 'Lighten the yoke your father put on us'?" The young men who had grown up with him replied, "Tell the people who have said to you, 'Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make our yoke lighter.' Tell them, 'My little finger is thicker than my father's than my father's waist. My father laid on a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." Well, Rehoboam begins by saying, "Come back to me in 3 days." This is a good beginning. He considers the request of the people. It's a positive start. It shows that he isn't being rash or emotional. He's going to think this thing through. So he begins by consulting the elders. This is also a good sign. It shows that Rehoboam is willing to seek advice and not trust only his own judgment. The men who had served in his father's government would be the natural place to start. They have the experience of having managed government policy already, and they know the truth about the current tax situation. They can tell Rehoboam if it would be wise or foolish to lower it, as the people have requested. So what do those men say? They say, "Lower it and they'll serve you always." The advice that Rehoboam receives from his father's generation is that he should begin his reign by demonstrating mercy and thus earning the loyalty of the people. In other words, they said it is better to be loved than feared. Better to have a government whose people obey it willingly than one whose people only obey until an opportunity to rebel presents itself. Now, I think this is good advice for parents, teachers, coaches, bosses, all sorts of people in authority. It is better to start with kindness and hope for loyalty in return than it is to start with harshness and have resentment be the defining nature of your relationship. There will be some who cynically respond that a policy of using power gently and with compassion is not realistic. They will say that it will only lead to getting you walked all over. But that attitude is based upon an adversarial definition of power, a us versus them mentality, and it precludes the possibility of cooperative and mutually beneficial relationships. The advice given by the men who worked with Solomon and saw his power is thus that his son should begin his reign as king with humility. So will he listen to them? We're told that Rehoboam rejected the advice of the elders and instead consulted the young men. Rehoboam rejected their advice to take it easy and be merciful out of hand. He simply wasn't willing to follow the path that they suggested. It wouldn't be the first time that a young person looked at the previous generation with disdain and concluded that he or she already knew everything and didn't need to listen. You and I have heard that such things are possible. Not that we were ever that way when we were teenagers or young people, but I have heard that they do that sometimes. Now that the advice of his elders has been rejected, Rehoboam turns to the group of young men who had been raised with him to see what they think. These would have been young men educated alongside Rehoboam, boys that grew up knowing that he would one day be their king. It was customary in most monarchies to have the young sons of other nobles and aristocrats raised as companions to the future king, in order to knit together that top echelon of power and encourage loyalty when power was transferred from one generation to the next. The primary drawback of such a situation, however, is that it makes it difficult for any of those young men close to the new king to be objective, to offer him advice that he isn't going to want to hear, because each of those young men knows that Rehoboam is their own ticket to influence and power and wealth. They're unlikely to cross him. So what do these young, inexperienced friends tell him to do? They start by saying, tell them that your little finger is thicker than your father's waist. I wrote wrist, no wonder I said it. It's waist. Clearly, they think that it is better to be feared than to be loved, because they're telling Rehoboam that the key to leadership is to act tough and demand obedience. This sort of response is all too common in families and workplaces. I see it all the time. When an objection about fairness is raised, when someone says the situation just isn't right, the person in charge actually increases whatever the unfair thing was, simply to shut up whoever is complaining and to demonstrate their own authority. Perhaps you've been on the wrong side of that kind of thing. Perhaps you found yourself doing that at some point in your life. It certainly isn't designed to make Rehoboam's subjects like him, to which the realist would say, good, being liked is overrated. Who needs to be liked as long as they do as they're told? Then they tell him, say this, my father made your yoke heavy, I will make it even heavier. That opening bravado and chest thumping has now turned into outright hostility toward those who dare to suggest that change might be needed. Notice this has nothing to do with what is right or what is fair. It is solely an exercise in the establishment of power over the people for its own sake. Rehoboam's friends have advised him that it would be better for him to appear strong than it would be for him to be just or fair. Lastly, they tell him, add this, my father scourged you with whips, I will scourge you with scorpions. This advice started as being haughty, and then it became unreasonable, and now it has just veered off the deep end and turned out to be cruel. To whip someone as a punishment is harsh enough. To increase the punishment by using a whip that has a piece of glass or metal attached to the end changes the whole scenario to one of simply wishing to inflict pain for its own sake. This is no longer a deterrent, but it is a sadistic reminder to all who might oppose authority of what will happen to them. We know from years of watching dictators and tyrants and thugs in our world that control through oppression like this just doesn't work. If those wielding it are ruthless enough, like someone like Joseph Stalin or Chairman Mao, they can buy time for their regime. They can even make it appear like the people are quiet by simply killing enough of them. But in reality, it is the beginning of a pressure cooker that will one day explode, no matter how tightly future leaders try to hold the lid down. The advice given to Rehoboam by the men his own age is horrible, but will he be able to see that? Or will his pride blind him to the disastrous result that such a haughty response is all too likely to cause? So what will Rehoboam do now that he has this advice? Verse 12, 3 days later, Jeroboam and all the people returned to Rehoboam, as the king had said, "Come back to me in 3 days." The king answered them harshly, rejecting the advice of the elders. He followed the advice of the young men and said, "My father made your yoke heavy, I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips, I will scourge you with scorpions." So the king did not listen to the people, for this turn of events was from God, to fulfill the word the Lord had spoken to Jeroboam, son of Nebat, through Ahijah the Shilonite. He answered them harshly. They rejected the advice of the elders. We could certainly look at Rehoboam's foolish decision as an illustration of a new generation dismissing the wisdom of their parents' generation and having to learn the hard way that just because they're old doesn't mean they don't know what they're talking about. That lesson is one that each generation must learn because unfortunately it is a truth that never seems to stick. We already know about the prideful self-assurance that affects both men and women when they come of age. Seems like there's nothing we can do to stop that from repeating itself generation after generation. Rehoboam's arrogance also speaks to us about how power over someone else can easily corrupt us and lead us to abuse of that power. Now, you don't have to be a king or a dictator to be susceptible to the temptation to abuse power. It can be something as small as the power of being the older sibling left in charge while your parents are gone. That's not much power, but it can still happen like this. Or you could be just the shift supervisor. Maybe you're only in charge of a couple of coworkers. If people are willing to utilize their power, however small it may be, over somebody else to their own advantage, it will always corrupt them. One of my favorite all-time quotes is from the British intellectual Lord Acton. Lord Acton wrote in his response to the idea of papal infallibility, and he said this: "Power tends to corrupt. Absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely." In other words, power is always potentially corrupting. The more you have, the greater your risk. This is a truth that we all know from simply living our lives. We have seen power and authority being abused by others against us. And we've all been tempted to, and some of us have given in to that temptation to do the same thing to someone that we have under our thumb. It is impossible to know which evil is the most common in our world or in human history. We're not going to know, is it lust? Is it rage? I mean, what's the greatest number of evil and sin? But I think it is safe to say that the lust for power and the abuse of power have far and away been the most destructive evil that mankind has indulged in. Read a history book and see the wars and the death that have come from this. We're told that this turn of events was from God to fulfill the word that he had spoken. Judgment upon the house of David was inevitable because of Solomon's turn away from God to the worship of other gods. It had already been prophesied by the prophet Ahijah when he told Jeroboam he would one day be king. The harsh actions of Rehoboam have made that prediction come true at the very beginning of his reign. God didn't need to take the kingdom away from him. His own foolishness is going to push the people away. So how are the people going to respond to this harsh answer? Verses 16 and 17. When all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king, "What share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, O Israel! Look after your own house, O David." So all the Israelites went home. But as for the Israelites who were living in the towns of Judah, Rehoboam still ruled over them. The people respond by basically saying, "We have no part in David anymore. Saul's kingdom had been taken from him and given to David, despite his son Jonathan's moral virtue because of his father's disobedience. David's failures had led to his son's rebellion against him. And now Solomon's sins have fallen upon his son, whose own pride became the final straw that broke the camel's back." The history of Israel as a monarchy has been a rocky one, something God warned the people about when they demanded that Samuel give them a king to rule over them. The future of the descendants of Abraham appears less secure now that they will be no longer united as one people. The Israelites living in Judah stayed with Rehoboam. Thus begins the division of the 12 tribes into a northern kingdom of 10 tribes that will from here on out be known as Israel, and a southern kingdom of 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, who remained loyal to the house of David and who will be known as the kingdom of Judah. These 2 kingdoms will be allies at times and enemies at times. They will fluctuate back and forth between obedience to God's covenant and rebellion, but both will eventually fall under God's wrath due to their immorality. One last thing in verses 18 and 19. King Rehoboam sent out Adoniram, who was in charge of forced labor, but the Israelites stoned him to death. King Rehoboam, however, managed to get into his chariot and escape to Jerusalem. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. This is a tragic ending to this foolish action by Rehoboam. He sends out one of his servants. In a final, sad ending to the destructiveness of Rehoboam's pride, his haughtiness also cost him the life of his man in charge of forced labor. Those in rebellion against the king looked upon him as a symbol of their oppression. It is simply further confirmation for us of the stubbornness of Rehoboam, that he thought the people would listen to Adoniram. And also his own cowardice, that he didn't confront them himself. He sent somebody else out to do it. Thus Rehoboam has begun his reign by destroying most of his father and grandfather's work through his own arrogance. And he got a man who was loyal to him killed. This is not a good beginning to his time as king. Maybe he will learn from his mistakes. Maybe he'll have a chance to redeem himself. And we'll look at the next part of the text next week. So the question for us this morning in conclusion is this. What do you do with the power and authority that has been entrusted to you? Do you think that those below you exist to serve you, or that your calling is to be their servant? We all have different levels of power, but we all have some. The question that God will one day ask of you is this: what did you do with it?